The night Nora Walsh came back to Millhaven, I was doing something embarrassingly ordinary. I was standing at my kitchen sink washing a single coffee mug, staring out at the fog rolling in off the Pacific, half listening to the rain tap against the window glass, thinking about nothing in particular. That's the kind of life I'd built in the 10 years since she left. A quiet one, a careful one. The kind of life where a man can stand at a sink for 20 minutes without realizing the water has gone cold. So when the knock came at my front door, I didn't rush. I dried my hands on the dish towel hanging off the oven handle, walked down the short hallway, and pulled the door open expecting nothing more interesting than a neighbor or maybe a package left by the delivery driver who always knocked instead of leaving things on the porch. And there she was, Nora Walsh, standing under my porch light in a gray jacket with rain in her hair and a small bag at her feet, looking at me the way a person looks at something they're not sure they have the right to want anymore. 10 years. 10 years without a call, a letter, a message through a mutual friend. 10 years of silence so complete that sometimes I wondered if I'd invented the whole thing. And now she was standing 3 feet away from me like time had simply made a mistake and corrected itself. I didn't say anything. I honestly couldn't. She spoke first. Her voice was the same and completely different. Lower somehow, quieter, the way a river sounds after a long dry season. "Cole," she said. Just my name. Like she'd been practicing how to say it on the drive here, and that was all she'd prepared. Then she looked down at the wet porch boards and said the thing I would spend the next several days turning over in my mind every time the house went quiet. I needed a reason to come back. I finally have one. Let me take you back. Because if you're going to understand what those words meant to me, you need to understand what her leaving cost me in the first place. I was 22 when Nora Walsh first walked into my life, and 22 when she walked out of it. Those two events happened 3 months apart, which tells you everything you need to know about how fast she moved through the world and how slowly the rest of us moved to keep up. She had arrived in Millhaven that August, chasing a photography internship at the small arts cooperative that used to run out of an old cannery building down by the harbor. I remember the first time I saw her because I nearly backed my truck into the co-op's parking barrier while watching her carry camera equipment across the lot with the focused expression of someone who had a clear idea of exactly where they were going and very little patience for the path. I worked at my father's boat repair shop half a mile down the same road. We crossed paths every morning for 2 weeks before she finally stopped and said, "You're staring at me every single day. Either introduce yourself or find somewhere else to stand." I said my name was Cole Mercer, and she said her name was Nora, and she had approximately 4 minutes before she needed to be inside, and was I going to waste them or not? I did not waste them. Those 3 months were the kind that don't feel like 3 months while you're in them. They feel like 3 years, and also like 3 days depending on the hour. We talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they're still surprised the other person exists. She showed me how to frame a shot, how to see light the way a camera sees it, how ordinary things become extraordinary when you put a border around them. I showed her the best spot on the ridge above the harbor where you could watch the whole bay fill with morning fog like something poured it in overnight. We ate bad diner food and good fish and chips. We sat on the tailgate of my truck watching the Pacific go dark, and she told me she had never stayed anywhere long enough to get attached to the ground beneath her feet. I told her I had never left a place long enough to know if I wanted to. She looked at me for a long time after I said that, and then she smiled. The particular smile she had that didn't reach her eyes right away but caught up a second later, like her face was just a little slower than her heart. The night before she was supposed to leave, we walked the beach until the sand got cold, and then we sat on the back steps of the co-op while the ocean made its sounds in the dark, and she told me she didn't want to go. I told her she didn't have to. She said she wasn't sure she knew how to stay. I told her I'd show her the same way she'd shown me how to see light. She laughed, and it was real, and then she got quiet in that way she had when something landed somewhere deep and needed time to settle. She held my hand the whole walk back to her car. When she finally said goodnight, she turned twice to look back at me. That was the last time I saw her, until she was standing on my porch in the rain. I woke up the next morning with the kind of hope that makes a person physically lighter. I had plans. Coffee, A drive down to the co-op, a conversation that would start with stay and end however it needed to end as long as she was still in Millhaven when the sun went down. I took a shower and put on a clean shirt and drove the half-mile down the road with the radio off because I wanted to think. The parking lot was empty. The kind of empty that has weight to it. I knocked on the co-op's side door and the director, a kind older man named Stuart, opened it with the particular expression of someone delivering bad news to someone who didn't know yet that bad news was coming. Nora had packed up before dawn. He didn't know where she was going. She'd left a note, just a thank you, nothing with an address or a number or anything that might let someone follow. I drove back to the shop. I fixed engines. I ate lunch by myself. I went home and stared at the ceiling until the room got dark around me. A week later, I heard she'd taken a position in Portland. A month after that, a mutual acquaintance mentioned she'd left for Seattle. Then nothing. Just the clean silence of someone who knew how to disappear without leaving a seam. For the first year, I told myself she would call. For the second year, I told myself she had her reasons. By the third year, I had mostly stopped telling myself anything and just gotten on with the business of living. I took over the boat shop when my father's knees gave out. I fixed things that broke. I drove the same roads. I grew familiar with a life that was comfortable and good, and filled, if I'm being honest, with a particular quiet that had a shape to it. The shape of the conversations I was no longer having with her. I dated a little. Nothing serious, though not for lack of trying on anyone's part. There was a woman named Carol who was warm and smart, and who eventually told me, without any cruelty in it, that she felt like she was always talking to someone who was listening from behind glass. She wasn't wrong. I just didn't know what to do about it. So there I was, 32 years old, standing in the doorway of my house while Nora Walsh dripped on my porch and told me she'd found a reason to come back. The practical part of my brain was cataloging the things that had changed about her. She was thinner than I remembered. Older, but not in a bad way. In the way that people look when they've actually lived inside their years instead of just passing through them. There was something different in the way she held herself. A stillness that hadn't been there before. At 22, she'd been in constant motion even when she was standing still. Now she just stood there and waited. I should have said something sharp. Something that communicated the weight of 10 years of silence. Something that let her know the door she'd left through without saying goodbye was not necessarily the same door she could walk back through with a reason and a small bag and rain in her hair. Instead, I stepped back and held the door open, because apparently some part of me had been waiting 10 years to do exactly that and wasn't going to waste another second. She picked up her bag and came inside. I made coffee. It was either that or sit in the living room and stare at each other across 10 years of unanswered questions, and my hands needed something to do. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the room the way people look at places they remember differently. The kitchen had changed since I moved in after my father retired. New tile on the counter, different chairs, a shelf of plant cuttings over the window that my neighbor Patrice had insisted I'd kill and I had stubbornly kept alive for 3 years just to prove her wrong. Nora touched the edge of the table and didn't say anything. I set a mug in front of her and sat down across the table. We were quiet for so long the refrigerator sounded loud. Then I said the only honest thing I had. I looked for you for a while. She wrapped both hands around the mug. I know, you knew. Stuart told me. He called me about a year after I left, just checking in. He mentioned you'd come by a few times asking if he'd heard from me. She paused. I should have called you back then. I kept my voice level. Why didn't you? She looked at me, and the answer she gave wasn't a simple one. She said, because if I'd heard your voice I would have turned around. And I wasn't ready to turn around yet. I hadn't become anything yet. I was still trying to figure out if I was the kind of person who could stay somewhere by choice or only by accident. That was the first honest thing I'd heard in 10 years, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I just drank my coffee and let it sit between us. She stayed at the Millhaven Inn that first night. She'd made a reservation before she drove up, which meant she hadn't been entirely sure I'd let her in. I appreciated that she'd left herself a way out. When she stood in the doorway to leave, I asked the question that had been sitting in my throat since she arrived. What's the reason, Nora, the one you said you finally have? She looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked uncertain. Not the confident, quiet woman who had stood on my porch in the rain. Something underneath that. Something younger. "I'll tell you," she said, "but not tonight. Tonight I think I just needed to not be outside the door." I nodded. "Tomorrow morning. There's a diner on Coastal Route 12. They still have the same coffee and the same bad pie and nothing has changed." She smiled. That same smile, the one where her heart was faster than her face. "I know," she said. "I drove past it on the way in." She picked up her bag and walked out to her car, and I stood in the doorway and watched her go, and this time she turned once to look back at me. That night I didn't sleep much. I lay in the dark and replayed the conversation in the systematic way you do when your mind can't let something go. The thing she'd said, that she hadn't become anything yet, that she'd been trying to figure out if she could stay somewhere by choice, it kept turning over in my head. I understood it more than I wanted to. There's a specific fear that belongs to people who are afraid of settling. Not afraid of commitment in the simple sense, but afraid of choosing a life and then spending the rest of that life wondering what else was out there. Nora had always had the kind of hunger that a small town can't feed. I'd known that when I fell for her at 22. I just thought I could be an exception to the rule of her restlessness. The way young men always think they'll be the exception. What I hadn't understood, until she said it across that kitchen table, was that she hadn't left because she didn't feel anything. She'd left because she felt too much and didn't trust herself to stay and be glad about it. That's a different thing entirely. I was at the diner at 8:15. She was already there, sitting in the corner booth with coffee and the plastic-covered menu she wasn't really reading. She had her hair down and she was wearing a dark green sweater, and she looked like someone who had been awake for a while and had decided to stop pretending otherwise. I slid into the booth across from her, and the waitress, a woman named Deb who had been working there since before I was born, refilled Nora's cup without being asked and looked at me over her reading glasses with the precise expression of someone who was going to have opinions about this situation and would share them with me later. We ordered eggs. We talked about small things first, the drive up from Portland, the way the harbor looked in fog, whether the cannery building was still standing. It was, turned into apartments now. And then Nora put down her fork and said, "I owe you the reason." I waited. She said, "6 months ago, my mother had a stroke. She's okay, she recovered most of her function, but for about 3 days we didn't know." I flew back to the hospital in Coos Bay and I sat there and I thought about what it meant that the only 2 people I called in those first hours were my mother's sister and my colleague in Portland. And I realized I had spent 10 years building a life, and I didn't have anyone in it who knew me the way people know each other when they've been paying attention for a long time. She picked up her coffee. Her hands were steady. I had good work. I had an apartment with high ceilings and good light. I had people I liked and dinners I enjoyed. But I didn't have anyone who would know I was hurting before I told them. I didn't have a person. She looked at me directly. And I kept thinking about the fact that I'd had a chance at one, and I'd gotten in my car at 5 in the morning and driven away without saying goodbye because I was 22 and afraid. The diner filled up around us while she talked. Deb refilled our coffees twice. Outside the window, the fog was starting to thin, and the harbor was coming through in pieces, silver and slow, the way it always did. Nora said, "I'm not here because I need you to save me, Cole. I'm not here because I'm alone and sad and running out of options. I'm here because I think I was wrong about something important and I want a chance to say that to your face. I'm here because I left without saying goodbye and that was cowardly and you deserved better. And I'm here because I have thought about you more than I've thought about most things that have actually happened to me in the last 10 years, and I figured that was probably worth paying attention to." I looked at her for a long moment. "Is that the reason?" I said. She shook her head. "There's one more." She reached into the bag beside her on the seat and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. She set it on the table between us. It was a photo of the ridge above the harbor, the spot where I'd taken her that first summer. The light in the photo was early morning. The harbor below spread out like hammered silver. The pine tree at the ridge's edge bent from years of ocean wind. It was extraordinary. The kind of photograph that made you stop and hold very still? I went back up there, she said quietly. 3 weeks ago. I drove down from Portland with my camera, and I hiked up to that ridge, and I stood there for about 40 minutes, and I thought, he showed me this place. He wanted me to see it the way he saw it. She touched the edge of the photograph with one finger. I took about 200 pictures. This one I printed, and I've been carrying it with me since, and I think the reason I've been carrying it is because I didn't want to bring it to him and have him tell me to leave. I looked at the photo for a long time. Then I said the thing I had been deciding whether to say since she knocked on my door the night before. The night before you left, you held my hand the whole walk back, and you turned around twice? I've thought about that a lot. Those 2 times you turned around. Nora went very still. I think you wanted to say something, I said. I think you knew in the morning you were leaving and you couldn't say it. And I spent a long time being angry about that and then a longer time just being sad about it. And now you're sitting across from me with a photograph of a place I showed you because I wanted you to stay, and you're telling me you've been carrying it for 3 weeks, and I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do with the fact that part of me never stopped being 22 years old in that parking lot, thinking she'd be there when I got there. She didn't look away. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. I'm asking you to let me be a person you know again. Slowly, if you want. That's all. Not a grand gesture. Not a promise I'd heard before. Just a request, carefully worded by someone who had spent 10 years thinking about the difference between what she wanted and what she had the right to ask for. Deb came by and left our check without being asked. I picked up the photograph and looked at it one more time. You want to show me where you stood when you took this? Nora looked at me like she was calculating something. Now, the fog's clearing. It's a good morning for the ridge. She was quiet for 1 second. Then she said yes. We hiked the ridge trail that morning with our coffees still warm in travel cups, the smell of pine and salt air mixing in the cold. The trail was familiar to me in the way that things become familiar over years. Not just known, but worn into the body. I'd walked it dozens of times since she left. Once I had thought I should stop walking it. Then I decided that would be giving something away that I hadn't agreed to give. So I kept walking it. I just walked it alone. She led the way to the exact spot where she'd stood for the photograph. She knew it by the bent pine tree and the angle of the harbor below. She set her bag down and stood at the edge and looked out, and I stood beside her. The fog had pulled back to the open sea and the harbor was below us, small and silver and complete. The same as always. I missed this, she said. The view, the feeling that something is permanent. She turned to look at me. In the city, everything keeps changing. Buildings go up, places close, the neighborhoods shift. I kept going to places that had been good and finding something else in their spot. It made me feel like I couldn't trust what I was seeing. She looked back at the harbor. This is still here. You're still here. Everything I left is still here, and somehow that makes me feel like I'm the one who needs to account for the time. I thought about what to say. Then I said, I'm not the same. She looked at me. I'm not the 22-year-old who stood in that parking lot with a plan and a clean shirt. I looked out at the harbor. I'm somebody who spent 10 years building a life that I'm actually proud of. The shop is mine now. I know this town the way you know a person, the bad days and the good ones. I have a life that fits me. I just wasn't sure for a long time if it was missing something or if I was making excuses for something that was already gone. I turned to face her. What I'm saying is I'm not standing here waiting to go back to who I was. I'm standing here as the person I actually am now. And I'm trying to figure out if you are too. She held my gaze. I am, she said. I promise you that. I didn't come back to find the version of you I left. I came back to find out who you are now. The wind came off the water and moved through the pine tree above us, and for a moment the whole ridge was just sound and light and the feeling of something deciding to be honest. I said, then stay for a while. No conditions, no timeline. Just stay and let me actually know you this time, and you know me, and we'll see what that looks like. She was very still. What if I'm better at leaving than staying? You said you drove past the diner on the way in, I said. That means you drove through town before you came to my door. You went past every single thing you left 10 years ago before you knocked. I looked at her. That's not someone who's afraid of staying. That's someone who was looking to see if staying was still possible. She started to say something, then stopped, and then the thing I hadn't expected happened. Her composure broke, not dramatically, not in a way that was loud or performed, just a quick and honest fracture. The way a voice breaks when something true lands too close to something tender. She pressed her hand over her eyes for a moment. When she took it away, her eyes were bright. "I drove through town 4 times, she said quietly. Before I knocked, I looked at her. 4 times. I kept losing my nerve. I'd get to your street and then drive around the block again." She laughed, a small, wet sound. "The 4th time I told myself if I didn't stop the car I was going to run out of gas and have to explain why I was idling outside your house at 9 o'clock at night. Almost. I almost laughed. Only barely. 4 times, I said again. 4 times. If you've ever loved someone who didn't know it yet, or loved someone who once left you and spent years wondering if you'd imagined everything, you'll understand exactly what those 2 words meant standing on that ridge. It wasn't the grand confession, it wasn't the sweeping gesture. It was a woman who had spent 10 years building a life telling me she had driven around a single block 4 times in the dark because she was that afraid of what she needed, and that certain it was here. We stood on that ridge for another hour. Not talking the whole time, just being there, in the same place, in the same light, for the first time in 10 years. At some point she took her camera out and I watched her work. The focused quiet that came over her when she was in it. The way she moved around a subject looking for the right angle with the patience of someone who believed the right moment was real and was willing to wait for it. She was better than she'd been at 22. A lot better. Her eye was slower and more certain. She didn't rush the shots. At one point, she turned the camera toward me. I said, "Don't." She lowered it. "Why?" "Because the last person who pointed that thing at me is someone I haven't seen in 10 years and I'm not sure I know who I am to her yet." She lowered the camera entirely. Then she said, "You're Cole. You're the man who showed me this ridge and talked to me about light like it was the most important thing in the world. You're the man who didn't fill the silence when I needed quiet and didn't disappear when I needed company. You're the man I drove away from 4 times last night because knowing I was going to see you was the most scared I've been in a decade." She said it without looking away. "That's who you are to me. The same as you always were, just more of it." That was the moment. If you've ever stood somewhere and felt the exact second when the ground shifts under the weight of something true, you know what I mean. I didn't move for a moment. Neither did she. The ocean was below us, and the sky was wide and pale, and the pine tree moved in the wind, and everything was exactly as ordinary and completely as extraordinary as it had always been on that ridge. I crossed the short distance between us, and I did what I had been too slow to do 10 years ago on the back steps of a cannery building, when the Pacific was dark and the night was quiet, and a woman I was already falling for told me she didn't know how to stay. This time I didn't wait for a better moment. I just reached out and put my hand against her face, the way you do when you want someone to know that you see them. All of it, the whole complicated 10-year thing, and you're not looking away. She leaned into it, slightly, just barely. Like a reflex, she'd stopped fighting. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The drive back down was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that has weight in it. The regular kind. The kind between people who have said the true thing and don't need to say it again immediately. She followed me back to the house and I made lunch. Nothing impressive, just what was in the refrigerator, and she sat at the kitchen table with her camera and went through the morning's shots while I cooked. At some point she turned the camera around and showed me one. The ridge, early light, the harbor below, and me standing at the edge looking out at the water. She had taken it when I wasn't looking. "That's the one I wanted," she said. "I looked at it for a long time." "You can keep it," I said. "I already have the file." She set the camera down. "I was going to give you the print." I looked at her across the kitchen. "Then I'll make room for it." She stayed in Millhaven for 6 days that first trip. She walked every road she'd known that summer and a few she hadn't. She spent 2 mornings at the harbor with her camera and 1 afternoon helping me at the shop when a client canceled and I had a stripped impeller to deal with, and 2 free hands would help. She was useless with engines and entirely too cheerful about it. She handed me tools with the confidence of someone who had no idea what they were giving me, and I corrected her without raising my voice, and at some point she started taking notes in her phone on which tool was which and asked if there was a test later. I told her the test was whether the engine started. She said she expected partial credit for effort. We argued about it for 20 minutes in a way that felt like 10 years had been no time at all. On her last evening, we sat on my back steps with the lights off and the harbor below us going dark, and she told me she would come back. Not a question, not a conditional, just a simple statement of intention delivered to the night air. I told her I'd be here. She nodded like that was the answer she'd driven 4 times around the block to find. She left the next morning before I was up. But this time, there was a note on the kitchen table. She had left it under my coffee mug so I'd find it when I made my first cup. It said, "I know how to say goodbye now. I've been practicing. This one means I'll be back on the 14th. Save me the booth at the diner and don't let Deb give it to anyone else." I folded that note and put it in my wallet, right next to a photo I had never admitted to keeping. The photo was of that ridge, taken 10 years earlier the morning after I showed it to her. I'd taken it with a disposable camera I used to keep in the truck. It wasn't a good photo. The light was all wrong. My composition was clumsy. But there she was at the edge of it, hair caught in the wind, looking out at the harbor with that look on her face, the one that meant she was somewhere between being present and being somewhere else entirely. She was back on the 14th, and on the 30th. And 2 months later she called me from Portland at 11 o'clock at night and said she'd been offered something in Coos Bay, a gallery contract, local and regional work, and she wanted to know what I thought, not in a leading questions way, in a real way. Like my answer was a data point that mattered. I said, "The ridge has good light all through October. You haven't photographed it in October yet." There was a pause. Then, "That's your professional assessment." "That's my personal assessment. My professional assessment is that you're talented and this is a good contract and you should take it because it suits you. But if you're asking whether October on the ridge is worth staying for, I'm telling you it is." She took the contract. She moved to Coos Bay on a Tuesday in late September, which was close enough to Millhaven that it was no longer a trip to come here but a drive. The kind of distance people cross without thinking about it when the person on the other side matters. She still had her apartment in Portland as a studio for now. Still figured out slowly the way she did everything. I had told her once that I could be patient and I meant it, not as a transaction but as a truth about myself. I had learned in 10 years of quiet how to wait without resentment. Not for her specifically, for things. For engines to show you what was wrong with them. For weather to turn. For the right moment, which was usually just the next honest one. The Sunday she moved in, I drove over with tools, and we spent 4 hours assembling furniture in a way that was significantly less efficient than it needed to be because she had opinions about direction, and I had opinions about following instructions in order, and we disagreed on both counts with the comfortable confidence of people who had already discovered they could disagree without the ground giving way. At the end of the night, we sat on her new floor eating pizza from a box because the table was still in pieces and the chairs were buried behind boxes. And she looked around the half-assembled room and said, "I think this is the first place I've moved into that I wasn't already planning to leave." I looked at her. "What does that feel like?" She was quiet for a moment. "Terrifying," she said, "and completely right." At the same time, I nodded. "That's how most good things feel." She looked at me sideways. "When did you get wise?" "About 4 years ago. I read a book about it." She laughed. Loud and real. The laugh she'd had at 22 that was too big for polite company and didn't care. I had missed that laugh in the particular way you miss something you didn't know you were carrying until you set it down. That night I drove back to Millhaven on roads I had driven 1,000 times, and the harbor was below me as I came over the ridge, lit up in the dark, the same as it had always been, small and permanent and entirely itself. I thought about what Nora had said about permanence, about looking for something she could trust to be there when she looked back. I had spent 10 years being exactly that without knowing if it was enough. Now I was beginning to think that staying in place, staying true to a life while the world changed around it, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the hardest kind of courage. The kind nobody writes songs about. A year after the night she stood on my porch in the rain, Nora was in Millhaven on a Saturday for a market where a local gallery was showing her harbor work. I came down after closing up the shop and found her standing beside a large print of a ridge photograph. Not the one she'd taken that first morning back, but a later one. October light, the harbor gold below, the pine tree casting a long shadow. It was extraordinary. There was a small crowd around it. I stood at the back and watched her talk to people about the work, where it was taken, what time of day, why this particular angle. She was good at it, not performative, just genuine. The way she was good at most things when she stopped being afraid of them. At some point she looked up and caught me watching. Her face did that thing where her heart was faster than her face. I waited until the crowd thinned and walked over. She said, "You didn't tell me you were coming. I didn't want you to wait for me instead of doing your work." She looked at the photograph, then at me. "What do you think?" I studied the print for a long moment. The harbor below, the same as always, the sky wide and pale above the ridge, and in the lower right corner, barely visible, a figure standing at the edge looking out. You had to look closely to see it. When you did, you couldn't unsee it. "Is that me?" I said. She pressed her lips together. "You told me not to photograph you." "Nora, technically I photographed the ridge," she said. "You were just in it." I looked at the photograph one more time. 10 years of a life in a quiet town. 10 years of early mornings and cold fog and an engine shop and a ridge I walked because I wasn't willing to give it away. All of it distilled into a figure at the edge of a frame, looking out at something that had always been worth looking at. "It's the best thing in the room," I said. She was quiet for a beat. Then, "I know." I reached over and took her hand. She let me, and then she held mine back, the way she'd held it the night before she left, 10 years ago, on a dark beach with the ocean making its sounds around us. The same hand. A different night. A different version of both of us who had, through some combination of patience and stubbornness and a certain faith in things that stay, managed to find each other on the right side of a door. I have thought about the things she said when she first came back, about needing a reason, and I've come to understand it differently over time than I did on that rainy night. The reason wasn't the photograph, or the gallery contract, or her mother's hospital room, or the 4 times she drove around the block before she knocked. Those were the circumstances. The reason was something quieter and harder to articulate, the kind of thing that only becomes clear in retrospect. She needed to know she was choosing to come back, not being pulled back. She needed to have become someone who could stay because she wanted to, not because she had run out of road. She needed to walk back through that door with something in her hands, her own work, her own name, her own life, so that what she was walking toward was a choice and not a retreat. That's the thing about people who leave the right way. The ones who are running toward something rather than just away from it. Sometimes they come back. And when they do, they bring everything they became in the leaving, and you find out you've become everything you became in the staying. And the two things fit together in a way that neither of you could have predicted when you were 22 and afraid and standing on a beach in the dark. She left without saying goodbye. But she came back knowing how to stay. And some nights, when the fog rolls in off the Pacific and the harbor disappears below the ridge and the house is warm and quiet and she's working at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold the way mine always does, I think about the young man who stood in an empty parking lot with a clean shirt and nowhere to go. And I want to tell him something. I want to tell him, be patient. Be someone worth coming back to. Build something real out of the years while you're in them. Learn the difference between waiting and living, because they are not the same thing, and one of them will hollow you out and the other will fill you up. She found her reason. I kept the door open. That was enough.